Good afternoon. I'm going to be doing three things. First, I want to talk a little bit about the place of law within the Jewish tradition, and then I'm going to talk about social issues in Jewish law, and then I'm going to talk about within America, and then talk about personal issues within Jewish law. So that's the lesson plan, okay? I'm a professor after all. And I'm married to a teacher who's a much better teacher than I am. Okay. First of all, you probably know, those of you that are Muslim certainly know, and those of you that are Christian have a sense of it, I think, that law plays a very central place in the Jewish tradition. Because those of you who are Christian may read parts of the New Testament that seem to say that Judaism is law and only law, I have to hasten to say that that's not true, that the Jewish tradition has a lot of other resources like theology and prayer and moral tracts and literature, belles lettres, even recipes, things on that order, okay? So, and a lot of cultural traditions that come along with the faith, including art and music, especially a lot of music. And so, when you're talking about the Jewish tradition, you're talking about really a civilization. You're talking about an expression of human place in this world and human connection to God that includes all of those aspects. What is true is that law is fairly central within the Jewish tradition, and part of that is a function of the fact that our central story is just the one that we celebrated in Passover. And the central story is really very different from the American understanding of things. In the American understanding of things, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What am I quoting? Yes, the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson cribbed that from John Locke. Locke had said life, liberty, and property. And Jefferson changed that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you can imagine how many doctoral dissertations have been written about that one. But as an American, I'm an individual with rights. And therefore, we're all from Missouri. We're all from the show me state. That is, the government has to show me why a particular right that I should enjoy needs to be restricted or taken away altogether. Now, the government does that in some cases, so we just pay taxes. That's a way of the government depriving you of some of the money that you earn, and there are good justifications for that. If you want to have roads and bridges and defense and education and all of those kinds of things, then we have to pay for those things. But by and large, if I am an individual with rights, then the government owes me. And by the way, if you've never read the 9th Amendment to the Constitution, you should do that, because there the Founding Fathers said that in addition to the first 8, in which they give us all kinds of rights, anything that they forgot to include are now included by virtue of this 9th Amendment. It's a very broad amendment. The Supreme Court has never used it because it's so broad, except in conjunction with the First Amendment or the 14th Amendment or something on that order. But the point is that the Founding Fathers really saw us as individuals with rights. The central Jewish story is Exodus and Sinai, and then on to the Promised Land in Israel. And we don't leave Egypt as individuals, we leave as a community. And when we get to Sinai, we don't get a single right. We get 613 commandments. This is the beginning of Jewish guilt, right? But it also is the beginning of a very different way of looking at yourself. I'm not an individual with rights. I am a member of a community with duties. And that is a very different way of thinking of yourselves. Now, sometimes rights and duties are reciprocal. If I have a duty to you, that establishes a right in you. But they're not all reciprocal. And certainly if I get up in the morning and think one thing, it's very different from thinking the other. Now, why does the Jewish tradition put so much emphasis on law? In part because we begin with 613 commandments. And that is the substance of, that's a large part of the substance of the covenant that we have with God and with each other over the generations. And it is also the way in which the Jewish tradition tried to articulate not only ritual issues, but also moral issues. So I'll give you just one example. The Torah says, Deuteronomy 22, when you find a lost object, you have a duty to return it. Okay? So the rabbis ask, okay, what happens if you hold it up and 5 people claim it? Okay? Then you have one sort of problem. On the other hand, what if you hold it up and nobody claims it, then what? This is all before lost and founds, by the way. So how long do you have to keep it? And how often do you have to announce the fact that you have it? And, let's say maybe it's an animal, maybe it's a cat or something. Do you have to feed the cat at your expense? What happens if you're allergic to cats and you didn't want a cat in the first place, right? So all of these kinds of questions are questions that get asked in the second chapter of Bava Metzia. It's a chapter of the Mishnah and then later of the Talmud, because that's exactly what the law does. It takes these general principles that exist in the 613 commandments, and it tries to make them concrete. Or things like, justice, justice shall you pursue, in Deuteronomy 16. Well, what does that mean? What concept of justice do you have, and how does that get applied in specific circumstances? Love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19. Okay, what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? And the rabbis actually spell out a whole series of things that it's not just a matter of attitude for us, it's a matter of action for us. So later on, Nachmanides in the 14th century will say that we have to provide health care for each other as a function of love your neighbor as yourself, to take one contemporary example. And so consequently, what the part of the reason why the Jewish tradition put so much emphasis on law is because this was, A, because we were commanded, and B, because this is the way in which the Jewish tradition tried to spell out our moral duties and also the limits of our moral duties. In the end, after a year, you don't have to announce it anymore if you found this lost object, and it's yours. Okay, so the thing is, and that's important, because if you're doing morality simply on the basis of principles, principles are eternal. And what you need to have is a sense of what are my obligations and where do they end. And that's what Jewish law does for us. It also, in the ritual areas, it gives us it makes an art out of life. It marks occasions in the life cycle and in the seasonal cycle. And in that way, it makes life much more meaningful. It's the exact opposite of Sartre's book, No Exit, if you ever read that, right? Where every day is like every other day, and therefore life is meaningless. But what the ritual system does is that it punctuates life. So once every 7 days on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, that's a very different kind of day than the other 6 days of the week. And it's made so by a whole series of things, but among them by the ways in which Jewish law has us delineate the day. Now I want to get to, so that's the reason why Jewish law is really important. Let me say one last thing about it, and then I'm going to go to my second area of discussion. In the modern period, starting when Jews started living in Enlightenment countries, that starts with people with Germany in the 1760s, France, and after the French Revolution, of course, here in the United States earlier on. Talk about Roger Williams, the very first Jewish community in the United States was in 1654 in Rhode Island, and they stopped in New York, but Peter Stuyvesant would not let them stay there, and so they moved on to Providence. And so, I mean, the thing that you need to understand is that once we are living in Enlightenment countries, we have the exact same freedom of religion and freedom from religion that everybody else has. And beyond that, it's going to be American law that's going to govern in all kinds of things in our lives that used to be governed by Jewish law. Because until the Enlightenment, the way that the Romans and then the Muslims and then the Christians organized society was in a corporate structure. That is, they started with the Romans. They conquered a lot of the world. They simply did not have the manpower to rule it, and so consequently they allowed the various countries that they had conquered to rule themselves, as long as those countries paid taxes to Rome and also provided men for the armies when necessary. And that was basically the system that the Muslims used and the system that many of the Christian sovereigns used as well. And so Jews basically Jewish law was literally authoritative, enforced by courts and by modes of enforcement until the Enlightenment. But once you got into the Enlightenment, then all of that changed. And so now in modern America, there are several movements. The Orthodox on the right, the conservative, which is the movement that I'm part of, despite its name, is in the middle, and the Reform movement on the left. And those three movements have very different understandings, very different philosophies of Jewish law. To what extent is it binding? How do you determine what the law requires of you? How does the law maintain authority and continuity and nevertheless change in time in order to be able to be relevant to modern circumstances? Those are all things that are in a philosophy of law. That's why I brought that book along, For the Love of God and People, which is a philosophy of Jewish law. It happens to be my own philosophy of Jewish law, and I stand within the middle movement. So you'll see a lot of the pieces on the right and on the left that are integrated in the way that I understand Jewish law. But you should understand that there will be people, Jews in the Reform movement, who will not think that Jewish law should be binding altogether, that it's a matter of individual choice. There are people to my right in the Orthodox world who will think that Jewish law is not only binding, but that it is largely stationary. That it is whatever was in, let's say, the Shulchan Aruch, a 16th century code, is what Jewish law is for us today, and that there's very little wiggle room to change it. Whereas in my movement, Jewish law is binding, but it also develops over time. And that if we're going to be historically authentic, we're going to have to be able to adjust it to modern circumstances and to new issues, stem cell research, and so on down the line. Okay, the second part of what I want to talk to you about now, which is applying Jewish law in social settings. I grew up at a time when the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren was making the wall of separation between church and state ever thicker, and frankly, the Jewish community cheered them on, because as a small minority in America, in a largely Christian majority, the more that there was a separation between church and state, the more liberty we had and the less pressure we had to follow Christian practices. I'm 68, you don't have to guess. And so I was in elementary school in the 50s and in high school in the from 57 to 61. I remember that starting in November, we started practicing Christian songs for the Christmas pageant in public school. I remember that, we obviously had the Christian holidays off, and if you wanted to take the Jewish holidays off, you could do that, but you had to get a special excuse for it and all of that. And the teachers, I still remember it, instead of a number one excuse, which was they stamped a very big red number one on it if you were out of school because you were ill. But if you were out of school for some other legitimate reason, it was a number two. But most teachers never saw a number two excuse. So when I would bring them my number two excuse, they would say to me, "What did you do?" Right? But you need to understand that we are roughly 2% of America's population. We are 0.2% of the population of the world. Christians are about a third of the world's population, Muslims about 20% of the world's population. We are 0.2% of the world's population. And so consequently, as a minority, we were very much interested in the separation of church and state. But then I found myself on 4 different federal government commissions, and now I'm on a state commission. I was first on Hillary Clinton's healthcare task force. May it rest in peace. And I was on the ethics committee of that. Now, I have a Ph.D. from Columbia in moral philosophy. There were 5 secular ethicists there. I wasn't there for that. I knew that the first day that we met because there were 5 secular ethicists. There was a priest, 2 ministers, and a rabbi. right? So, I mean, I knew that from the very beginning. I'll give you the second thing is even funnier. I was on the Surgeon General's task force to create a call for action for responsible sexual behavior. This was 99-2000. And I was on the executive committee of that project as well. And so there was a meeting of the executive committee in the Department of Health and Human Services. So there were like 12 of us around a table. Every one of us had multiple degrees, okay? And everybody was calling everybody else by their first names. Me, they called Rabbi. So I said, I do have a first name. It's Elliot. You're welcome to use it. And the Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services, who was the chair of this commission, who was a Roman Catholic from Boston, Irish Catholic from Boston, said, if my mother ever heard that I called a rabbi by his first name, there would be hell to pay. Okay, right. So for the rest of that project, I was Elliot for some people, but rabbi for most others. And then I was on the National Human Resources Protections Advisory Commission. This was to review and revise the federal guidelines on research on human subjects. And there again, it was largely that. And on the state commission that I'm on now, on setting the ethical guidelines on embryonic stem cell research, the legislation actually says, the California legislation says, there are supposed to be, I think it's 3 secular ethicists, a priest, a minister, and 3 people from religious backgrounds. Okay, so I'm not there as a secular ethicist, even though I do a lot of that stuff. I'm there as a rabbi. So that led me to rethink this whole thing. What is then the place of a religious view, a religious vision in setting social policy? And I must say that, and in the other book, To Do the Right and the Good, I actually talk about Judaism. There's a chapter there, Judaism and National Policy, in which I talk about what is, at least as I understand it, the appropriate role for religious insights in setting national policy. You've heard a lot about the First Amendment this morning. And I must say, and I've done a lot of reading on that, and I must say that I'm very much a Jeffersonian here. Jefferson said that when religious groups agree overwhelmingly on a particular moral issue, then the United States can legislate. So religious groups agree, for example, that murder is not a good thing, and so the law can prohibit it. Religious groups agree, largely, that theft and rape and a whole series of other things, assault, are not to be permitted within society, and therefore the law can prohibit it. Conversely, most religions would say that it is proper to require parents to give an education to their children. They should have some say as to what kind of education, but nevertheless, it's a duty to give some kind of education to your children. Most would agree that there should be some kind of taxation so that we can do certain kinds of things as a community that we cannot do as individuals. Roads and bridges, for example. So on those kinds of things, you can have laws. But Jefferson said, when you have significant elements of the population who disagree on a moral issue, then the government should stay out of it. That should be a matter of individual conscience and individual religious conviction. And I must say that that's exactly the way that I see it. There's one other thing that I would say is that again, very much Jefferson here, he did not believe in what Richard John Neuhaus later called the naked public square. That is, a public marketplace of ideas that was bereft of anybody's backgrounds. He believed that the way that you get wise social policy is that you get everybody to the table from a variety of different backgrounds, and you let them, yeah, good, thank you. Oh, 10 minutes, I thought I had less than that. Okay, very good. That you get them all around the table, and you let them argue it out, okay? And that, I think, is exactly right. It's very Aristotelian. It's also very Talmudic. I mean, the Talmud is one page of arguments after another, right? It leads to the usual Jewish joke where there are 2 Jews, there are at least 3 opinions, right? Except when somebody came up to me one day and said, do you really need 2 Jews for 3 opinions? Okay, right. But the point is that here, but that's exactly, it's in many ways the Jewish way, but it also is the Aristotelian way, and it's the way that Jefferson thought that we would be able to get wise public policy. That everybody came, you said what you believed and why you believed it. That doesn't mean that the fact that you claim religious authority for it is enough to establish it as American policy. That's the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, right? No religion may, on the basis of its religious convictions, establish public policy. But on the other hand, there is the Free Exercise Clause, which says that we should all be exercising our religion vigorously and committedly, and that should be true in the realm of public policy as well as in personal matters. Let me now go to personal matters. Jewish law and American law there are several issues that come up in regard to some conflicts. Some conflicts and some issues that American law raises for us dealing with Jewish law. One issue is divorce. The United States, like virtually every other jurisdiction, loves marriage. And so consequently, even though there is a way in which one is supposed to get married in California law, you take out a license and all of that, right? Nevertheless, post facto, if you're living together as husband and wife, the state of California wants to recognize that. That was a common law marriage, and in California, according to the Supreme Court in 1976 of the state of California, even palimony will be recognized. If you remember this, well, some of you are too young to remember this, I'm sorry. But there's a decision of the California Supreme Court that even if people are not really, don't announce themselves as husband and wife, but simply are living together, there are certain obligations that accrue to each of them if they later split up. And it depends upon how long they're living together and all of that, okay? But when it comes to divorce, then, and by the way, Jewish law is the same way. There's a way to get married in Jewish law, and this is the way you're supposed to do it, okay? But retroactively, if you are living together as husband and wife, you're married, okay? But when it comes to divorce, that's a whole other matter. And there, both the American legal system and the Jewish legal system assert authority. So if you're an American Jewish couple and you want to be divorced, you have to be divorced in American law, but you also have to be divorced in Jewish law, because if you're not, and you marry someone else, then that's adultery, and the children of the second marriage are mamzerim, are illegitimate. Now, there are complications in my last statement that I'm not going to go through at the moment, but it's different for men and women, and it's a whole series, and of course it's different among the movements. But if you're talking about classical Jewish law, this raises real problems, because sometimes a couple will get, and by the way, I don't want to exaggerate this, in the vast majority of cases, 95% of the cases, it goes without a hitch. There's a divorce in civil law, and then there's a divorce in Jewish law. But in some cases, there is not a divorce in Jewish law, either because the man has to initiate it in traditional Jewish law, either because he's not able to, he may be demented by this time, or you don't know where he is, or more frustratingly, because he refuses to do so. Now, sometimes he refuses to do so for good reason. Now, the civil court said that he's going to have custody X number of days a week, and she's going to have custody X number of days a week, and she's preventing him from seeing his children. Well, then, if that's a good reason to refuse to give his wife a get, because this will put pressure on her to abide by the decree of the civil courts. But most of the time, it's not that, unfortunately. Most of the time, it's out of anger. I don't want to help her have another marriage. All of those kinds of things. And so that's one place where American law and Jewish law interact, and so what we have had to do in the conservative movement, the Orthodox movement are still trying to deal with this, but what we have done is figured out ways of annulling marriages that are this way, and using prenuptial agreements to annul those marriages. So that this kind of a thing, it's called, she's an aguna, she's chained to her first husband. And in order to avoid that, we now have prenuptial agreements that we use to avoid that. A second area in personal things is the dietary laws. Now, those are very clearly dietary laws that apply to Jews, and not all Jews observe them. And so consequently, you would imagine that state authorities would want to stay out of that. The one problem is sometimes there's fraud. So sometimes the meat that is sold as kosher meat actually came from Ralph's, okay, or something on that order. And clearly the state has an interest in preventing fraud and in prosecuting it. So then the question becomes, all right, well, how does the state fulfill its interest in preventing fraud? And how, on the other hand, but how does the state understand when it is fraud and when not? What constitutes kosher meat? Who's your authority for saying so, right? And that, of course, gets the state into very hot water because we in the conservative movement believe that Jewish law is binding and that we have standards of keeping kosher, of kashrut, that are somewhat different from those in the Orthodox world, and the state clearly should not get involved in what is kosher and what is not. And so each of the, especially New York and California, have dealt with they have the largest Jewish communities, have dealt with this in several different ways, in a way to try to make sure that fraud doesn't happen, but at the same time not violate the separation of church and state. And finally, one last thing that I'll mention, which is this. In Jewish law is not the same as the Roman Catholic position on abortion. We do not believe that it's a full-fledged human being at the moment of conception. We believe that it's a developing human being over time, and that if the woman's life or health is at stake, then we not only may abort, but we actually must abort, because she is a full-fledged human being, and the fetus is not until the moment of birth. At the same time, abortion largely is prohibited in our tradition, not as an act of murder because you don't have a full-fledged human being there, but as an act of self-injury. And in the Jewish tradition, our bodies belong to God. Again, very different from the American tradition where our bodies belong to us, right? But in the Jewish tradition, our bodies belong to God, and we have a fiduciary responsibility to take care of our bodies. So consequently, whether you are a man or a woman, if you get up one day and you want to amputate your thigh just for the fun of it, you might be certifiably crazy, but other than that, you don't have the right to do that in Jewish law because you are injuring yourself. Well, in the same sort of a way, if the fetus is part of the mother, it's seen as the thigh of the mother. That's the reason why I use the word thigh, the example of a thigh here. From 40 days on in pregnancy, then by and large she's not allowed to abort. But there are times when she's required to, and times when she's only permitted. Very different from American law, and so basically what I have to do as an American Jew, rabbi, is say I'm pro-choice, because I think that there are many different views about abortion among Americans, and therefore the American law should stay out of it. But then I have to tell my fellow Jews, by and large, abortion is prohibited.